Does consecrating bishops against the will of the Pope violate divine law? Is papal authority absolute? If you've struggled with this question, I hope that this video will bring a little more clarity to the fog that is beleaguering the SSPX debate. So in the coming months, the Society of St. Pius X is expected to consecrate new bishops without papal mandate, just as Archbishop Lefebvre did in 1988, when he consecrated 4 new bishops against the will of Pope John Paul II. And now the same situation appears again, and with it comes a very serious objection. It sounds simple, it sounds strong, and honestly, at first glance, it seems almost impossible to get around. The objection is this: consecrating bishops against the will of the Pope not only violates ecclesiastical or human-made law, but also divine law. And that is a very serious claim, because if that claim is true, the entire discussion whether Archbishop Lefebvre was justified in 1988 or the SSPX will be justified is basically over before it begins. Because human laws can sometimes admit of exceptions in extraordinary circumstances, but divine law cannot be set aside. If something truly violates divine law, then no crisis, no state of necessity, and no appeal to the salvation of souls could ever justify it, because divine law binds always and everywhere. So the key question is really, does consecrating bishops against the will of the Pope fall into such a category? And in this video, I want to argue that the answer is not as simple as many or some critics of the SSPX make it sound. So to understand this properly, we need to make some distinctions that are often skipped over in this debate, in my opinion. We need to look at the nature of papal authority. We need to distinguish between the authority itself and the exercise of that authority. And then we need to look at the moral object of the act itself. But before we get there, let's make the Steelman argument for the objection and consider it in its strongest possible form. The argument usually begins with something that is true. The Pope does possess the authority to choose and appoint bishops, and that authority flows from his universal jurisdiction over the Church. Vatican I teaches that the Roman Pontiff has full and immediate jurisdiction over the entire Church, not only in matters of doctrine, but also in matters of discipline and governance. And the appointment of bishops belong to that area, so you can see that it is divinely established. This principle is also reaffirmed, for example, by Pope Pius XII in his encyclical Ad Apostolorum Principis, where he explains that the right to appoint bishops belongs properly to the supreme pastor alone, and that no one may lawfully consecrate a bishop without a mandate from the Apostolic See. So up to this point, the argument is correct. The reasoning then continues like this: since the Pope has the divine right to appoint bishops, no one else has the right to do this independently of him, and so if someone consecrates bishops against the will of the Pope, then he is usurping something that belongs to the Pope by divine right. And if someone usurps something that belongs to another by divine right, then the act must violate divine law. And that leads to the conclusion: when Archbishop Lefebvre consecrated bishops against the will of the Pope in 1988, he then violated divine law. And the same would apply to any future consecrations. So if this argument is true, then the act would also be intrinsically evil. You could not justify it by appealing to necessity or crisis or the salvation of souls, because divine law cannot be suspended, and the end can never justify evil means. And that is why this argument is so powerful, because if the main premise is correct, the conclusion seems unavoidable. But already here, we need to mention something important. Many Catholics today approach the papacy with a distorted framework, actually. They fall into what Dr. Kwasniewski calls hyperpapalism. A lot of modern Catholics speak about the papacy almost as if the Pope were an absolute monarch, and as if every decision he makes becomes unquestionable simply because it comes from him. It's shut up and obey all the way down. And in practice, this creates a quasi-nominalistic view of authority, actually. Whatever the Pope declares must automatically become correct. And then the job of us Catholics is simply to perform whatever mental gymnastics are necessary to reconcile it with tradition afterwards. But that is not a Catholic understanding of the papacy. The Pope is not an oracle, and papal authority is not some unlimited power detached from its purpose. The papacy is, in a very real sense, constitutional in nature. The authority of the Roman Pontiff is there for a specific end. It exists for the preservation of the deposit of faith. The Pope is meant to be the guardian of tradition. He is not its master nor its jailer. And so papal authority does not justify itself simply by being papal. Its legitimacy is inseparable from the purpose for which Christ instituted it. And this distinction matters enormously because once papal authority is treated as functionally absolute, then basically every single command must bind absolutely, and every act of justified resistance becomes rebellion against God himself. But that has never been the Catholic position. Think about Peter and Paul in Galatians. There is a real difference between possessing authority and exercising that authority in a just manner. And that brings us to the central assumption hidden inside the argument against the SSPX consecrations. The argument assumes that because the Pope possesses authority by divine right, every individual exercise of that authority must also be correct and binding in every possible circumstance. And that is exactly the claim I want to examine. So let's distinguish between two things. First, possessing authority by divine right. Second, exercising that authority correctly in every individual case. And those are not the same thing. Let me give a simple example. Imagine a father, let's call him John, and John tells his son, Marcel, you're not allowed to leave the house after 9 p.m. And Marcel wants to obey, but one night after 10 p.m., Marcel looks out of the window and sees a man, let's call him Parrish, get hit by a car. Parrish is lying in the street screaming for help, so Marcel runs outside and gives him first aid. Now ask yourself, did Marcel do something wrong? Did he violate divine law because he acted against the father's command? Did he usurp parental authority by deciding for himself what to do? That might sound absurd. But think about it. John, as a father, really does have authority over Marcel. And that authority is divinely affirmed by the fourth commandment. So yes, John has authority from God to set rules for his son. But does that mean that every single command from the father is infallible and must be obeyed in every single situation, no matter what? Of course not. The existence of authority, even when divinely affirmed, does not make every command infallible. So if a command can be mistaken, then that command itself cannot simply be identified with divine law. And the same distinction now applies to the authority of the Pope. The Pope truly possesses authority by divine institution over the governance of the Church, including appointments of bishops. But possessing authority and exercising it correctly and justly in every individual case, again, are not the same thing. Authority, even when it is divinely instituted, can still be exercised fallibly when, and that's key, it is mediated through a human person who is not divinely inspired. And since the Pope is human and not God, this must also apply to his acts outside the conditions of papal infallibility. And papal infallibility applies only under specific conditions. Outside of these conditions, the Pope can make mistakes. Recognizing this, that's also very important, does not deny papal authority as such. It does not deny papal infallibility as such. It simply acknowledges that papal authority cannot be absolute in every case and in every act. And that leads to a necessary conclusion. If a particular command can be mistaken, then that particular command is not itself divine law. It cannot be. And if it is not divine law, then failing to follow that command under the right circumstances does not automatically constitute a violation of divine law. So acting against the will of the Pope when it comes to consecration of bishops does not necessarily mean violating divine law. The argument could be over now, but we need to mention one more point, because the word necessarily matters, because there is a case where it could become a violation of divine law. And that brings us to the final point, the moral object of the act, or to put it more simply, what the act itself is actually ordered towards, its intention. In Catholic moral theology, intention matters a lot. Intention can even make an act that looks good from the outside become morally wrong for the one who perpetrated it. Think about the fifth commandment. Thou shalt not kill, and murder is always wrong. But the Church also teaches that killing in legitimate self-defense can be justified. If someone attacks my family, and I kill him in the process of defending them, I have not violated divine law. Externally, the act looks the same. someone dies. But morally, the act is different. Why? Because the intention and the circumstances are different. Now take it one step further. Imagine if the attacker is someone I deeply hate. And imagine that my intention changes. Instead of thinking, I must protect my family, I begin thinking, I want to kill this man, and protecting my family is just the occasion. Then the moral object has changed. The act has moved from defending my family to deliberately killing a man who I hate. And in that case, I would violate divine law. Now let's apply this to episcopal consecrations. Such an act would only be against divine law if it were done with the intention of defying the Pope as Pope or rejecting his authority as such. In other words, if the intention moved from we are consecrating bishops without papal authorization in order to preserve the traditional sacraments for the faithful, to we are consecrating bishops in order to oppose and undermine the Pope, then and only then, yes, in that case, it would become a violation of divine law. But that is precisely what the SSPX denies. They consistently state that they do not reject papal authority. They say they act out of what they believe is necessity. And they say their goal is to preserve the priesthood and the traditional sacraments. So their stated intention is not to defy the Pope. So we can draw two conclusions. First, acting against the will of the Pope, even when his authority is divinely grounded, does not necessarily mean violating divine law. Second, in this case of the SSPX consecrations, the moral object is not defiance. The stated object is the preservation of the traditional sacraments and the care of souls, and therefore such an act, considered in itself, does not constitute a violation of divine law. So next time, when someone tells you that the SSPX is violating divine law, you can send him this video, or even better, you can tell him that his argument actually rests on a basic confusion. He's confusing the existence of papal authority with the assumption that every individual exercise of that authority must always be correct. And once he does that, he effectively makes the will of the Pope absolute, and that is hyperpapalism. The Catholic Church does not teach hyperpapalism. Of course, the Pope possesses authority over episcopal appointments. That is not the point. The real question is whether that authority is absolute in every possible case. And we have seen now that it cannot be so. So the question we actually need to ask is this: could the present circumstances of the Church justify such an act? And that question cannot be answered with slogans and a quasi-nominalistic way of arguing, where whatever the Pope wills is treated as automatically correct simply because he declares it. It requires actually a serious examination of the crisis in the Church. And that is where the real debate actually begins. But that will be something maybe for another video. So I would be very interested to hear your thoughts on this question as well, but especially on the consecrations. Do you think they're justified? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. And before I finish, I want to mention two final points. One is more personal and one is about the channel. So last year, I wrote a children's book about Godfrey of Bouillon and the First Crusade. And my wife, who is an artist, illustrated it very beautifully, in my opinion. I will also link to her work in the description. So the book came out last year in October in Germany and Austria. But now the book has also been translated into English, which I'm very happy about. And I'm currently looking for a publisher in the US or the UK. So if anyone watching has experience in publishing or knows someone who might be interested, feel free to reach out. I would really appreciate it. And my email is also linked in the description. And also the second thing, as you may have noticed, the channel now has a new name, not Christ-Pilled, but Logos and Lore, although I'm still Christ-Pilled, of course. And also a face, but I am still the same person as previously, which you may have noticed from the voice. And I want to thank everybody who has already subscribed to my channel over the last few years, because yes, this is actually really the third video in a series that I promised a long time ago. So thank you for your patience also. And going forward on this channel, I want to explore Tolkien and tradition. So Tolkien, as you may have noticed, I'm a great fan of Tolkien and also of the Catholic faith. And I want to explore Tolkien through the lens of a Catholic mind and Catholic tradition through the lens of Tolkien. And if that is something you're interested in, please consider subscribing. And also, since a kind viewer once asked me how to support me, the best way, of course, is prayer. So please keep me and my family in your prayers if you wish. But if you would like to support the channel further, there's also a link in the description. So thank you so much for watching. And until next time, remember to fight along the feet and stay faithful in the ruins.